All right, we might start for the next one. So next up, we have Glenn Rogers and Janine Donelly from EY, who are presenting on the data and process and systems implications on IFRS 17.
Uh-oh.
Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully today has been quite fun for you all. I think after lunch is always the most difficult presentation, especially 1 hour after lunch. So hopefully we won't make you go to sleep too much. I'm Glenn Rogers, I'm a partner at EY. I'm our InsurTech lead for Asia Pacific, but for this particular area, I'm also the IFRS 17 technology lead for Asia. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to present here today.
Hi, my name is Janine Donelly, also a partner at EY. I look after our finance transformation space and have been deep involved in quite a number of sort of impact assessments, as well as sort of helping people move towards implementation. So exciting times.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Janine. So I guess how I've got involved in this journey, because I grew as an InsurTech person, was I often see in the market there's been a real demand, to bring technology expertise into this actuarial and accounting change. And in addition to that, being able to have support engines that can deliver it. So we've been focusing certainly and looking at how do you deliver to small, mid-size and large insurance carriers an IFRS 17 change, and in particular around the data systems process, because as we drill more and more into it, there's probably 50 to 60% of work effort is very much in the technology or the change space. Especially if you're going to go for a transformation. So part of that, and certainly what our firm's been doing, and I think a lot of the other firms, is building delivery engines, methodologies and thought leadership around that so that we can get through this journey, because this is not an easy change. This afternoon specifically, Janine and I are going to cover the data systems process area. I'll talk a bit more at a macro of what are the 6 fundamental changes that we're seeing, and then Janine will drill more into some of the technical aspects around the process and data area. Hopefully this tech will work. So as I just highlighted on this slide, the change is really not just around accounting and actuary change. I think we find in the ecosystem there's significant change in the business end-to-end. And you'll see this from the regulatory aspect. It's really looking at what are the components of change around your operating model, your people, your systems, or your processes, or the technology components. And when you bring that all together, you get very complex and at times costly change. So that's something to bear in mind is what do you think the degree of change is, and then how are you going to manage that? And on this next slide, I think a good question to ask all of you here is, how many of you in your current existing IFRS 17 programs is it still being driven by financial controllers or CFOs? A show of hands. Curious? Mm-hmm. And look, I mean, that's not really surprising, and it's not negative. I think what it is, though, is that this is just much more. It certainly is. If you're a more complicated company, like a life insurance provider, it's much broader than just sitting in the CFO space. And I think, we're certainly looking at these areas around, the accounting, the actuarial risk, a lot of the business operation impacts, etc. And in fact, I've got a few here, sorry. I think some of the things that you need to look at is, with this change, obviously it's about accounting balances, it's how the actuary engines work. There's a lot of areas around the target operating model, around people and process. What's going to happen with my people and the interactions with that as this change goes through. There's a lot of the system points that we'll discuss later on around what are the various impacts there. And I also think there's a very big thing around operations. How is my operations going to work? And then how do I manage that as an integrated program? So by that, having an integrated work schedule. Janine and I have worked a lot with a number of carriers, and it's a very complicated work plan to get this through over the next 18 months and then be able to say, right, we've got parallel processing occurring. We've now got a new open report, then a closed report, and the new standard running in parallel. So I'm basically running 2 different systems or processes for 12 months to then when I'm ready. And that does consume a lot of resources. And we are seeing that some organisations are looking at outsourcing a range of that if they're not as complex, so putting that up into a cloud-based solution that's less complicated, or if you actually want to maintain complete control, building larger programs internally. From the big picture, I think the interesting thing here is, and I'm just going to cover off a couple of points. From a policy perspective, what we see the major changes is really looking at the policy procedures and the controls. What are the methodologies that you're going to use in the future state for IFRS 17? I think the actuarial model assumptions are different. So it's what does that mean to your business and your operating model? And some of the investment policy changes from IFRS 9. So when you bring those things together just from policy, that's a parcel of work that should be embedded in a work plan. If we then move on into the process area, we're looking at what is the reporting and closing procedures in the future going to look like, and how do we do that? So how do we design that via functional designs? What templates are we going to use, etc. So just some of those basic things around the processes become very complicated when you combine accounting and actuary processes, let alone the technical processes that sit along that. Like there's a whole range of batch processes, there's a whole lot of reporting processes, etc. So that builds a layer of complexity. And then it's also a lot of the internal controls that we look at and a lot of the audit functions. What do they need to be updated to meet the standards? Which again sort of sits into that data systems process area, because a lot of that back-end information feeds into these management controls. From a performance management perspective, I think it's very key, in a finance component of the company is what's our planning and budgeting process moving forward? Things have changed because of this standard. So we need to think about that. What are the KPIs for the business that need to be measured? What are the, a lot of the value-based management structures that sit around that? So those things together have to be reviewed and designed and then built on. So already we've got 3 key areas within, the finance, actuary, accounting area that are looking for changes just on that, even before we touch in on the systems. Organisation, I think, is pretty key. A number of these departments traditionally have worked in silos, certainly what I've seen. Things are going to need much more integration as we get through this, and therefore designing that, so investing in a change management component. I've often seen that if you don't have 10% of your budget dedicated to people and change, you haven't spent enough, because there's going to be big impacts on those departments, especially if you're a larger organisation moving forward. So you need to spend the time so that you can understand what the future state looks like, and more importantly, communicate that with your people. Because this is not something that's learnt overnight, it's something that requires, even internally in our firm, we've had weeks and weeks of internal training on the standards. We continue to go through that, and we continue to review the technical impacts of that so that we can go out and advise you. So there's a lot of change in our organisation, so it's equally important, I think, in the insurance industry, the change impact and understanding that. Data is critical. I work a lot with our data architects in this space. When we go into clients, they often have, some of them might have data warehouse or data marts, data lakes, etc. And the first thing they say is, can we reuse that? And we often say, right, coming from a source or legacy systems, you then look at the data element and what's that producing, and then how that feeds into your actuary engines and also your GLs through to your close reports. And there's a lot of analysis required on, is my current data model sufficient to deal with that? And normally the answer is no, it's not. So therefore it needs modifications. And then what then has happened is you've probably seen a number of sub-ledger solutions that have creeped in. And we're finding with certain clients around Asia in particular, where they've chosen sub-ledger solutions, they're at times choosing not to update their data model. They're saying, right, we can get, if the sub-ledger solution has got the right inputs in terms of all the data fields needed, we can take that from legacy or an existing data warehouse, move that into that, and then push that through to the actuary and then into the GL. So there's very, very different solution designs that you go through, and that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of work. So, there's a few points here on data, sort of readiness, gathering, cleansing, what's my target state data requirements, what's the solution that sits around that. I think, questions around, do I upgrade, convert or migrate? They can be expensive and costly and, time-intensive programs. So these are very critical decisions that need to be made that often the CFO and the finance controllers, etc., need a lot of support from IT and experts in that area to give them guidance as they make decisions. Technology, which is pretty much where I sit, I work a lot in this area in terms of evaluating end-to-end systems. I've put in a lot of core systems over the years. Janine's an expert in all the financial engines from her background, and when we put this all together, we've come up with many variations of different solutions. But one thing that's consistent is, you've got to make timely decisions. You know, we found in the last year the market's been a bit slow to sort of pick up and make decisions on IFRS 17 because the standard has moved to the right a little bit. And I think the further you delay your decisions, you know, the worse off you're going to be. That's our recommendation, because it does touch your technical solutions, touches all your data, minimal impact on your back end generally, but you know, GL updates, you know, CSM changes, etc. That requires a lot of thinking to get right, and then a lot of testing. So testing for, you know, mid to large size companies, we're often looking at periods of 3 to 6 months prior to parallel running. And then when you go into parallel running, you'll obviously every month do comparisons there in terms of your financial results. So advice is always, and reminding people, start early, start fast, and keep it simple. If you don't have a lot of time and you don't have a lot of money, I think the less complicated you make it and the less change you do to a technology solution, the better off you're going to be. But then there is the other paradigm where some firms look at it as being a time for finance transformation. So all the things that they wanted to do in the past, CFOs and the like, I say this is an opportunity where we can either change our actuary systems or we can change the way our data is migrated and moved. Doing potential, we've seen some carriers in Europe do upgrades to their GL for this. So this can also be a finance transformation opportunity. But I suspect going down that path now with the clock ticking, you're probably almost missing that window for true finance transformation, unless, again, the standard moves to the right. People, I can't harp on enough about this. I've worked with a couple of life carriers in Hong Kong and in Australia in this space, and it's very difficult to get everyone in a room to agree, you know, because whenever anyone hears finance, they say, right, that's just the finance team, the actuaries will drive it, right? And often they make decisions that are based on their own corporate professional experience, but it's the ring fence of all the other impacts that come on. So I always think having strong stakeholder management up front and getting them involved and ensuring that if the CFO is the sponsor, that he or she's got a very strong number two that's probably a technologist. I would highly recommend having a technologist right there with them, because then they can really understand the systems and burdens and impacts. And the other key thing is, you know, strong communication and strong planning. I've seen a number of programs kick off where the level of detail and rigor in the assessment phase and the outputs of that in terms of work plans, you know, communication plans, etc., mightn't have been to the level that's needed. And I think, you know, that's a good question for all of you to ask is, what are we doing around stakeholder engagement, all of our commerce plans and work plans to make it successful? And then ultimately getting buy-in so that when the change happens, everyone in each department that's impacted is on board about that. We're now breaking down into the people process or the data systems process area. And Janine will do a lot of this with some case studies. But I think this is an interesting slide. You know, just a typical, you know, life insurance company. You've probably seen this, it's standard model, right? And we just, we like to use this as a going in blueprint when we look at assessments. And we just color code it. Right? Green means the most or the minimal impact due to the IFRS 17 change, red being the highest. So some of those areas around product strategy, product design, you know, some of the financial components of claims management in terms of reinsurance and reserving. I mean, there are various areas that you can just pick off from here and see where we see larger impacts. And this is always a useful baseline to scope your work, because you can actually scope the work by solution, but you can also scope it by what are the organisational impacts to my company, and then what are the work packets that sit underneath that. So we use this often as a guide to get you moving through your work. I'll now hand over to Janine, who's going to give some more examples about the financial impacts, and then she'll go into the systems and processes area. Thank you. There you go.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. And yeah, hopefully I'll be able to pepper this with some examples of what discussions we've been having with people out in the market today and where they're sort of focused on. So before I get into that, just to sort of go back to the operating model a little bit and to sort of pick on a piece here, you know, in terms of the areas that we are seeing a little bit of movement and change in is around reinsurance. So just thinking through from that sort of business perspective, so terms and contracts and sort of looking at that. So that's where we're saying it is a wider change than just sort of in the finance and actuarial area. So there is, and we are seeing some movement and discussions being had between reinsurers and their counterparties in terms of how can they best, and then how when they go into the next sort of range or next round of reinsurance, how can we rethink how we're sort of doing our programs against some of these contract boundaries and our business. So it is quite expansive, and we need to think through it more wider than just sort of that finance part. So from a purely finance perspective, we have to get the reports out. We need to get our stat accounts out, our regulatory reports out. So realistically, what needs to happen or what needs to change, I always start from the process and then think about how do I use the systems and data to support those processes. So clearly, the first thing, our closed calendar is going to change. And it's going to need a lot more steps in it to bring lots of things together, and we'll see that in sort of the data and systems soon, in an environment where we're being sort of asked to report faster and faster. So we're going to have to report dual reporting for a while, as well as more complex reporting in terms of how we get to the end result in an environment where we're just being asked to do it faster and faster. So that is difficult, and it's going to require a lot more integration of teams and people around their business units, and particularly within sort of the actuarial and finance area. So the process does need to come together, and I think that one of the good outcomes of this is there is going to be more integration between particularly the actuarial and finance. I see some actuaries and finance people sitting together on that table over there, so already a positive outcome, I think. So the actual finance reporting, the face of the P&L balance sheet, there are fundamental changes to that, and it doesn't look as bad, on the face, but underneath and how you get to it is clearly different. And I think there are new sort of ways to sort of calculate that. There's new ways that we have to build up towards that. So clearly a different process in terms of how we get the data that we need to do, how do we get the data in the right place at the right time with the right controls around it. I think if you look through the disclosures essentially forcing up to the presentation layer reconciliation between your actuarial processes, your cash processes, and your actual processes. So that fundamentally means our control environments and our data really needs to be front-ended and brought to sort of bear. Otherwise, we're caught out at that presentation level. The planning, performance, management, I think, at times when we start this process left off, and it's almost an extension of Glenn's question, it starts off very much around the financial control or the reporting teams and the actuarial reserving teams. But realistically, it has to move into the performance management. We will have to start thinking about forward planning now. How are we going to incorporate, our IFRS 17 results as part of that? For our capital planning, for our dual reporting environment that we're in. So planning and performance is something that we need to think through, how we're going to look at those processes. And I think that's the one where we actually are going to be forced to do wider and more education around our business unit stakeholders as we support planning and performance processes. And as I touched on, control and audit procedures, we are literally we will not have time to go back and do reconciliations and, last minute entries in terms of the environment we're in. So it's how can we embed those controls as we work through. So these are the processes that are forcing us really to relook at the data and system side of the equation. So I won't go too much into the slide. I think we've sort of, gone through it enough. But what we've tried to do here is kind of match up those stakeholders to the processes, to those sort of key systems of change. So we will need input from technology and IT. We will need sort of actuarial to help the modelling side of things, accountants, both from a controlling perspective as well as our performance reporting. So the D for data. So data, the sheer amount of data that we need to sort of do this is probably being driven from a couple of areas, and I'm just going to start backwards here. So the IFRS 17 is a huge driver of data, of better data practices. Why is that? So firstly, it's because of the increase in granularity for the valuation purposes as well as posting purposes. We're also needing a lot of data from a transition perspective. There is more detailed and granular disclosure reporting that's brought up to the presentation layer. And then we've got sort of just increase in new pieces of data and market data, just thinking through discount rates. So what that is forcing us to do across the organisation is really have a focus on data governance, data quality, data integration and automation. So really, how can we use some of the tools and the modern sort of tools in place now around automation and integration? How can we use this as an opportunity to sort of increase the level of automation and integration around sort of finance and actuarial processes? And really, what are the controls we're putting across our data environment from particularly an audit trail perspective? We can see that this has happened sort of in the banking environment. Really, we're going to have to increase and look at sort of our data quality controls and how do we trace data from our presentation layer back through the source, and what changes are we making to that data along the way. So where do you start? I think we always go in with this perspective where we kind of start from the presentation layer and start working backwards. So we understand what it is. So in terms of what we're doing with a lot of clients at the moment, we've done sort of a lot of work, and a lot of people have gone and done an impact analysis of IFRS 17. The part that is a sort of a no regrets piece is to have a look at what the presentation of the accounts look like. So the P&L, the balance sheet, and the notes, right? So I think that's no regrets work that can be done now, and force us to start thinking a little bit about some of the choices we need to make around policy. That's important because I think people need to understand for some of the choices it is a principles-based standard, and lots of choices are available. And I think one of the lessons we are seeing and learning from an insurer, particularly in our Asian market, and they've gone across and they've kept that in line, and they've made changes and tweaks to policy choices as they continue to get into the depths of the detail of configuration. So I think that's an important point to take. It's great starting from the top and working backwards, but I think being open to change and also making sure that you are focused on the profit outcome that you want as an organisation is important. And this particular organisation has made some changes and tweaks in terms of how they want their policy application to happen on seeing how the profit flows through. So again, starting from that front and working backwards. I think that also sort of forces that focus on data. So starting at the outcome that we want means, well, we're not trying to waste time from a bottom-up perspective, but working backwards and being very clear about the data lineage. And where do we get information from? Where do we make manual adjustments? Where are we bringing information together? How do we collate that information and control it is worth going backwards that way. That's where we can start to really understand the pure data requirements that are needed for IFRS 17. The only last point I would like to make, and I think I say this around all of the assessments that I've been involved. Obviously, we work very closely, I work very closely with our technical accountants also, as well as our actuaries. And for me, when I come in and I sort of start to think about the operational impact from a systems data process perspective, one of the first questions I always ask is, where are you on your level of aggregation? Where are you on your discussion of that? Because that does, again, force that sheer level of detail in the data required. And I think very quickly that's the area I want people to start looking at and thinking about, because that's the bigger impact on sort of data systems and process. The higher level of aggregation, the slightly easier it is as we go forward, is the short answer sort of that comes out of that from an operational perspective. So again, you have to always keep in mind, and I think having the financial impact alongside of the operational impact has to go not just at the beginning, but all the way through any kind of engagement or implementation has to be kept in line as you go forward. But level of aggregation, I think, is key to start at least thinking and talking through. Okay, systems. So I'll spend a bit of time on here, and we've kind of come up with this. It usually doesn't look this scary, but in most of the operational impacts that we do, we kind of just have what sort of the overall architecture, or a very simplified architecture, what does it look like, and where are we seeing big changes, medium changes, no changes. I think that the first one, the source systems, it's a little bit misleading here. What we are seeing from a source system perspective isn't that much of a change impact there. People generally have good source systems and have the related data in there. They need to put a bit more controls around the quality of data coming out. So that's important. So the data is there. The quality of data is something that needs to be thought through. The real point I wanted to point out here is we are seeing in some insurers a kind of a focus on reinsurance. Reinsurance hasn't been something that has been consistently stored or consistently processed. It's on the side. So that's an area where some insurers are focusing on being or getting a little bit more structured about sort of storing related reinsurance data and process or transactions related to that. So that's probably the biggest part or the biggest sort of change impact we're seeing around sort of that source side. Actuarial and risk models, clearly our actuarial models all will have to be at least looked at and changed in order to facilitate IFRS 17. So the calculation engine, it says CSM, but there's more than just CSM, I think. The calculation engines, the clear easy one is that we do need something in place to calculate a CSM, and we'll go into more detail after this about what we're seeing people do around that, what options they're looking at to fulfill that. Clearly that's more on sort of the building blocks approach. So that's important. Other calculations I think are coming into play, and again, the more we're seeing dual reporting requirements and multi-gap environments, other calculations come into play here. So cost allocations, again, I don't think there's a big impact here, but clearly from a source and target perspective, there will be a change that someone has to go make a change and align according to sort of allocation policy and choices. Accounting rules and posting engines, this is the big one. So again, the presentation of the P&L and balance sheet doesn't look so bad, but the level from where you have to post from is at that lower level of detail. So the complexity, as I like to say, the if, but, when rules are a bit more complicated under an IFRS environment. If it's this group and onerous, you post a different way. If, but, when. So those are generally a little bit more complicated, so you want to put a little bit more structure around how they're done. Now, what we see in people's current state environments, that some of that is done, some of it is there, some of it is just embedded in spreadsheets. They're within source systems, and absolutely 9 times out of 10, the way that actuarial data gets into the ledger now is someone passes the spreadsheet of the outcomes to someone to create a journal entry and post it in. That isn't going to cut it anymore because it has to be posted at that lower level of detail. So accounting rules is something that we're seeing a big lot of movement in, whether it's under the banner of the word subledger, but there is a lot that you need to do around your accounting rules. Even to the point of chart of accounts, your chart of accounts will change to support your disclosures as well as your trial balance. So your accounting rules are always going to have to change to post to those new chart of accounts. Consolidation, where people have consolidation, again, this is dependent on people's current states and how far they go in consolidation. Consolidation in some places, it means nothing because it's purely from an IFRS perspective, just adding up trial balances from different entities. Others, it's more than just consolidation, it's consolidation and disclosure, and of course that has a big impact. So again, it really comes back around to what people's current states are and what they want their target architecture to be. Consolidation per se isn't really being changed by IFRS 17, but clearly if you do have something that you do something, what we do see is for some insurers that don't have a complicated consolidation, they have a general ledger, but then they have a spreadsheet that does the consolidation. So anything that you change in your general ledger has to be replicated in wherever you do your consolidation, be it in a spreadsheet or another database somewhere. Planning and budgeting forecasting, we talked about that. Again, the consistency of data model between your actuals and your planning, budget and forecasting, just the sheer chart of account differences needs to be thought through. KPIs also, I think in this area is something to think about and how that's used. If you use driver-based, what drivers are you going to use, what KPIs are you going to use? It does look a little bit different now. I think it's fair to say that KPIs hasn't been thought through that much in this part of the world. Globally, people are starting to think through KPIs. What does it mean from a performance metrics perspective? What will IFRS 17 look like compared to sort of US GAAP? Quite simply, even from our perspective, gross written premium actually doesn't actually need to be on your chart of accounts anymore. We do still think, from an EY perspective, there'll be a period of time where we will have current metrics plus emerging metrics as we fully get into IFRS 17. It'll be interesting to see what can we pick up from the disclosures going forward that will sort of roll back into what KPIs are. And then obviously our master data management, the governance and risk is clearly an area that needs to change alongside of that. So even more simplistically, what could a solution look like? So what we've tried to do here is what we're going to start getting into. We know there's a lot of talk out there amongst clients and the market around subledgers. So we're going to sort of start to think through, why are people looking at this? Is it actually necessary? Are there different ways and approaches to do this? And the sheer answer is yes. Not everyone needs to go there. I think you need to be very clear about what you are, what your current state is, and what you want your target state to be. In this diagram, all we've tried to do is very simplistically look at what are the different vendors and options out there around sort of the actuarial systems and world, as well as what is it that we're looking for around that sort of subledger, and we'll go into that in a little bit of more detail. But again, it's trying to resolve some of the things we've spoken about already coming in to date, workflow and management of how we move data from multiple source systems and actuarial as it needs to go back and forward into calculations all the way through to the end, calculations, posting rules, and then the sheer data management. The general ledger still needs to be there. I think there's always choices about how thick or thin your GL is. That's the conversation that needs to happen as you start to think through, do I need a sub-ledger or do I need a general ledger, or do I use both together? Excuse me. So there's a couple of different approaches that we've seen out in the market of how people are looking at that architecture and resolving for it as they move from understanding their current state, what needs to change, to their target state. Now, as people do their current state assessments, they realise that there's a lot of change to actually implement, a lot of things that need to happen. So that means there's an opportunity to sort of do something different, to see what could we use from new tools and automation opportunities out there across your organisation, as well as the more modern technology that's available to you on the cloud, as well as sort of data. So one sort of approach that we're seeing a lot of, and again it depends on who drives the engagement, is where people essentially enhance the current environment that they have. So when we split apart components, the actuarial area, they're the ones taking ownership of the CSM. They can, they've got control of the data. They're essentially building on what they have. What that means is that we still think in those areas there's a potential gap for the account posting rules, and a potential con on this area is people haven't quite realised that the accounting rules have to go to a lower level of detail. And what that's potentially, as a potential con, is that it's potentially sort of driving, again, more to people-reliant business. An observation of insurance, finance and accounting is that we are over-reliant on people and Excel. So that is absolutely an option, and again, it depends on how well controlled your current state is around that sort of actuarial world, and how complicated the if, but, when becomes. Now again, the if, but, when rules are complicated depending on some of your policy choices, starting with level of aggregation, looking at onerous contracts. So it's a bit of a wheel, as you can start to see. So I think it's important to start looking at these together. Don't wait for sort of the accounting policy people. I think doing it together in consultation really gives a proper understanding of what choices you make, what the financial outcome is, and what that operational component is. Again, a lot of people are looking at the idea of an IFRS 17 specific subledger. So there are vendors out in the market that have invested heavily in their subledger tools, and specifically look to try and help insurers resolve IFRS 17 from a calculation perspective, from an accounting rules perspective, and a data model, an insurance-specific data model that helps on disclosures. I think for those people that are looking at these, there are additional benefits outside of IFRS 17. You have, in essence, you are building a one-stop shop of finance-related, of finance and actuarial data that is useful from a performance and analytics perspective. So there are additional benefits. People should be looking at that. A con, however, is that the investment and the cost is higher than sort of looking and enhancing your current state. The third one is particularly for those organisations that are sort of have multi-gap, multi-reporting relationships and have large investments in their GLs. It's working with their GL partners about sort of the capabilities and functionalities that come alongside of that can help them, again, through the calculations, the account rules posting, and again, that multi-gap environment. So we are seeing saying that we are seeing for those areas there, or for those insurers that are looking at big sort of partnerships with their general ledgers, they're still looking and assessing the use of a subledger, and in some cases have them side by side, which is interesting. I think as time moves on, all subledger vendors are increasing the capabilities and understanding of their subledger solutions, and they're getting more sophisticated as they move towards a final standard. So again, this is just trying to say that there are sort of overlapping requirements, and I think that's where some people are seeing the benefit of a subledger, where we're finally truly seeing the integration of financial and risk data in the one place. Which provides an opportunity, again, for better metrics and better sort of reporting and analytics. I think that's an important point for that true sort of more transformational, can we move our practitioners, our finance and actuarial practitioners away from preparation, away from cleansing, away from data management to more value add and support of the business from a true insurance metrics perspective. And we are seeing this as, as a design principle of many insurers out there, that they're going to use this opportunity to truly try and enable their people, particularly in the actuarial side, to get away from what is not value-add processes in terms of cleansing and preparation, and really truly use them for value-add to the business. Selecting the appropriate vendor, we think, we just put some sort of words up here, we think, and a lot of people are running these processes because they're good at running these processes, but really it's important to objectively look at it, not just from the capability provided on calculations. I think you should be looking at it from a usability and an analytics perspective. I think that's the true value add of this. A roadmap or a solution. There is no vendor out there, nor can they be, given the standard is still moving, that has completely got the answer 100% done and configured. Also, it's a principles-based standard, so there's different ways of potentially choosing how to do that. So the one thing I will say that if you go down this path, you are still don't expect a pure out-of-the-box, which we are seeing. Everyone thinks that there's not, well, they're still expecting a lot from us. There's a lot of input that is required if and when you go down that path. Partnership, particularly if you go down a software as a service perspective, remembering that, regardless of IFRS 17, a relationship with a vendor under software as a service is different. You're in a true partnership perspective, and it's really about that long-term relationship. Think about the interaction and, again, the end-to-end enterprise architecture. So how is it going to integrate, and how's it going to sit alongside of my general ledger? How's it going to sit alongside of my consolidation engine? How is everything going to hang together? Otherwise, you're maybe spending money and buying more than what you actually need.
Maybe just to comment on the area of vendor selection. We're seeing a lot of companies spend 3 to 6 months to make a decision. I've been doing this for about 30 years, and I always like to advise people that if you can fast track that, do it, because if you look at the risk dimension, 80% of them are alike. There's always a 20% gap. So how do you get to that 20% of the unknown in a very timely manner? I don't know, a fast track proof of concept, something that's different, rather than going through a procurement governance process that you don't need 6 months to make a decision. And I know we're naturally risk adverse when it comes to spending people's money, but there's smarter and faster ways to make a decision so you can actually get on and implement. But I see that as a big risk, is going through that procurement cycle.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I just wanted to, again, spend, what is it? So when they talk, or when people talk about subledgers, what is it? And again, I think it's important to look at it in the context of what you have and where other people are looking at the whole box or components of the box. So when we look at a subledger, what do we expect to get? Well, we expect to get a calculation engine, and we, for those specific IFRS 17 solutions, we expect to get a calculation engine specifically around CSM that is going to help us on that. So we expect out of the box for them to be able to do CSM, and we expect some calculation capability to help us with other other areas that we would like, whether it be allocations or from a dual reporting or parallel reporting, what else can it offer us? Accounting and posting engines, so the ability to maintain, store accounting rules and tagging rules, and the ability to create postings from that to go into your general ledger. So the benefit of this is in current environments, we see this all over the place. We see some embedded in source systems. We see some in ETL layers. We see some on spreadsheets. So this is about it's the centralized control of accounting rules and bringing it to the complete ownership of a finance area. So a lot of people globally have gone down this road even before IFRS 17. So there's a couple of insurers globally in the market who really have already looked at subledgers, again, more for the benefits of centralised account posting rules. Report generator and analytics. So, again, I just think there is a benefit, that the overall benefit of having one place that brings together your actuarial as well as your finance, as well as your cash information into one place. The sheer sort of power of having sort of that information in one place for analytical capability, I think is quite good. Data storage, so again, this is where they do come with data quality and data frameworks that help on that auditability and change as you sort of go through. And workflow management, that there are benefits to having these structured tools in helping you manage those processes and people. Again, some people, they don't use it for report generation and analytics. So again, I think you need to make sure you're clear on that end-to-end target architecture, where some organisations have a more enterprise component of that, and they want to use something else. So the account posting entries go into somewhere else. So that end-to-end architecture is important. And so working with technology is important. Again, some people don't use it for the CSM calculation. They prefer to keep that in the actuarial world. So I think, again, understanding and unpacking the subledger and what you're going to use it for is important. I think that's all we had. I don't know how much time do we have?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes. So I thought what we'd do is open up to questions, because we are seeing, again, we see lots of differences. We see differences because people have different accounting policy choices, whether from the highest level general model versus PAA versus the level of aggregation versus their current state. People are coming up with different, there's no one best fit. It really is adaptable. It really has to best fit what you want to get out of it. So we're happy to sort of open up to any sort of questions, I think. Sorry, the last part, sorry. So we are definitely seeing a huge focus on subledger. I think we are seeing people, so subledger is the most important one at the moment. We are seeing people look at their actuarial systems, not changing their actuarial systems, but managing them from an infrastructure perspective more formally. So getting it closer to technology. In some places we see, that the tool that they're using, be it SaaS or Profit, is sitting on a hard drive under someone's desk. So we're seeing on the actuarial model side more about that formality of moving it into sort of a more controlled technology environment. General ledgers, we are seeing just generally in the market a trend to move to cloud from a cost perspective and to software as a service. I think the timing, to Glenn's earlier point, timing is coming into that. I think that if there's a delay, I think there'll be more of a transformation with IFRS as an outcome and a little bit more movement in that general ledger world as well.
Yeah, I think also we track across Asia all the companies and what solutions they've chosen. And I think it's at least 50% still haven't made a decision on their target solution. So that tells you there's a lot of work in the market with finite resources, because there's not so many people or firms that can do this work. So I always encourage people, make decisions fast and get moving, because I think you're going to have a resource constraint in the next 12 months.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So one of the questions you mentioned people before, one of the questions was, we saw that with Solvency II, a lot of accountants and actuaries went to Europe to assist. With limited people resourcing and global standards, what do you suggest?
It's giving away our strategies as well. So there is absolute shortage. Us, as well as the other firms, as well as insurers, are absolutely concentrated and thinking about this topic and looking at other markets. Europe is definitely one of those, although they've got a big sort of IFRS 17 is big enough for them as well. So we're seeing sort of less from there. From other markets, we are sort of seeing people target South Africa, Hong Kong, not surprisingly at the moment. But clearly the fight for good resources on for not just insurers but for us as well. It is, I think it is something that people need to think through. in terms of that, but also being clear on what you need, right? In terms of the capability that you need just to do the change, that may not necessarily be what you need from that ongoing perspective. So I think and it's back to Glenn's earlier point, the whole target operating model is important. So from an implementation of a tool, that's one thing, and that shouldn't be that's a one-off. I think the more important thing is, what is your target operating model that you want going forward for your finance and actuarial area? So how do you want them to work together? Should they be in an integrated team? How can we sort of take away some of the less value activities out of accountants and actuaries from that data prep? And how can we get them moving, or how can we get them more sort of directed to being that value, that business partner? Now that's worth investing in, and there's a lot of capability already in this market. They're just having to, what we do is that we just deal with what we've got and we fix it, we update it in a spreadsheet, and we've become sort of quite a people-reliant industry here. So I think there's kind of two answers to that question.
Yeah, and I mean, on this journey, right, we said earlier about planning this out to when you're in the new world, and then working back and saying, what are my critical resources? Then, identifying, I guess it's really an HR plan on how you're going to retain them. And then when all the functions of your work packets are defined all the way through to implementation, which ones can you give to someone, a low-cost provider, to do for you? Because they might be low value add, or they might, equally importantly, you might have the right skills, so you might think you do, but give it to someone to make that decision. And then when you go to a target solution, certainly for the small and mid-sized carriers, do you need to have it all in-house? Can you go in a SaaS-hosted solution? There's a lot of activity in the market that we're seeing around that, and you might say that some of our core business we might put off to something else, because that means you can then focus your scarce resource on the activities that are really important for your organisation. But it's very detailed planning. You don't want to be in a situation where 3 or 4 people have just gone and they're right in the middle of kicking off the build phase to make the IFRS 17 standard. That's where you don't want to be, so it's planning up front.
Yep. So how many companies have you seen embark on the process and target operating model? So where we see most, we've seen a lot of work on assessments. Clearly, a lot of people have done the good work in terms of understanding, at least at a high level, what the impact is. Definitely during this year, we saw a slowdown of that moving into implementation. I think quite rightly, because we were still going through the standard and it's somewhat sort of changing. We are, since the ED, seeing a lot more movement in programs move towards implementation, and be clear about sort of moving those into more sort of structured programs of work, start more formally looking at that target architecture and looking at sort of systems along the way. So there's definitely a move to get going. I would think that sort of as we hit sort of next year, I can see that the train moving a lot faster next year. I, along with everyone else, will be waiting for the next IASB meeting where we get I hope, I'm not sure, and maybe someone else during this period will have a better idea, trying to understand what will happen around sort of the date of implementation. And I think that is going to be a key driver of how fast or not we go. I think that if it is, people really need to think about the more of a finance transformation first, with an outcome of IFRS 17 versus just an IFRS 17 part. What was the?
I can't see it.
Yeah. One of the questions, as a consultant, you mentioned that 10% of your budget should be implementation of IFRS 17. How do you get a CEO? Well, so I'm not quite.
Change.
Yeah. Change. Okay. How do you get your CEO board in there? So, what we do see, absolutely, as consultants, we help people through operational assessment. There's always oh my God, are you serious? This is going to cost this much. In terms of how many things we have to go and change and coordinate. There is always a bit of a shock value or a sticker shock value on bloody hell, we have to spend this much on an accounting change. That is always there, and then it settles down and moves. So then the question's asked, well, if I'm going to have to do that, what else can I get out of that? Which is why there's that focus on data, as well as the opportunity to properly automate, to think through new tools and to think through modern technology around cloud. So that's where people are kind of still in that area. The first shock really is that we are, I like the question in the beginning, we're not seeing it truly at that sort of CEO board level. In this market, we've had a lot of stuff going on. This is just one of many things. And so the focus has been in other places, quite rightly. We are starting to see, again, more interest and boards and sort of board audit committees coming down that way, asking their exec team and around where they are in their programs. So that is a trend we've only just started to see click up as well, where those people are sort of asking that. No surprise, sort of the APRA questions, has helped a bit of, or generate a little bit more thinking around sort of programs and work like that as well. Have you seen any? So have you seen any issues with insurers who back MGAs? The underlying data is not in the insurance system. So we actually have been working with a client at the moment that doesn't actually own the data, and they're quite an innovative company. I'll be honest, we haven't solved it yet, but we recognise that there's a problem. But there might be, there's a need to have a little bit more structure around how they're bringing through their data now when they don't particularly own the data. One of the ideas is almost to help them, in a way, offer some structured systems and stuff that helps them at the other end. So I don't actually have the answer. We're kind of working through different options with our particular client at the moment.
One more. Which should come first, target operating model assessment or system vendor selection?
Very good question, because we see both. I think directionally you should have, I don't think you have to have nailed your target operating model. I don't. And, it's good to understand what the capabilities are provided by vendors. I think to run both concurrently, I think you need directionally a target operating model and the key questions that you haven't nailed, so that you can use the vendor assessment to best understand what capabilities you could be using. So, so that means start with a target operating model, but it doesn't have to be perfect and final, because you're going to reiterate it as you go. But then sort of start to get to understand what's in the market and the capabilities that they could offer.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If it was a mature system like a policy or claim system, I'd never have a target operating model. I'd let the software drive your model, because they're best of breed. But the IFRS 17, the sub-ledger solutions are evolving, and I think you need to at least have parameters of your TOM, and then use that to validate that. So it's a bit of a horse and cart in some way.
Yeah, it is. And even, and I think that's true even for general ledgers, the art of the possible, try to understand the art of the possible and analytics and all of that. It needs to be sort of back and forward to see what, there's a bit of, working. And otherwise, if you do your target operating model first, sometimes you end up just rewritten what you actually have today. So understanding the art of the possible from the technology and capabilities out there is important, is almost another important input as you work it through.
Any advice on how to structure a carbon accounts during a power?
Yeah, that's not easy. I only know of one insurer that's kind of got a chart of accounts to deal with both. A lot of people are sort of, and this is where the question almost comes in again around sort of what do I use as a general ledger, and does it have the ability to have adjustment ledgers? So it's less about, so that means multiple charts of accounts. So, maintaining your chart of accounts, but having adjustment ledgers. But, ultimately it's working back from the reports and sort of going backwards. So it is possible. And again, I know one client that's kind of got there by sort of understanding what, agreeing first on what the outputs are and then kind of going backwards and then figuring out what they need. So you are going to have some accounts that are used as deltas as well, but it isn't an insignificant piece of work, and it's more about the long run. How do you make sure that in the long run you start to manage those dual accounts, because you will have sort of a messy, chart of accounts, and this is why people are looking at more modern ways of doing this, using sort of multi-ledger, multi-gap. Capabilities within general ledgers and sub-ledgers.
Thank you.
That's right.
No, thank you.